in my quest to understand my own spirituality, I started digging and researching and came across lots of interesting information. And the near-death experience to me was one of the most significant because it wasn't some, necessarily a religious organization or people trying to, put together some kind of organization or cult or something. It's just, I would meet people and they would tell me these amazing stories about what they saw on the other side. And I said, wow, after all this research, I've come to something that is very, very significant and has a lot of great information and brings us back to the heart, back to who we are as people, spiritually, ethically. And I've done a lot of other research in other areas prior to that. And so what I started to find is there was a thread between other types of spiritual occurrences that happen to people, transforming spiritual events. And so what I did, my goal in the Soul Code was to create a thread between all of these different things that basically show us that we are connected to a higher dimensional aspect of who we are. And this aspect has to do with our connection to the infinite. And from all this research, it seemed to point that this underlying field of energy that we are connected to is infinite in source, but it's love energy. And it's this pure form of love energy that we can't even grapple with it. It's so powerful and profound, and we are connected to that source. And even us in these physical bodies are just using a very small part of what we are connected to. We are connected to this infinite source of energy. And so I tied this thread between, I don't know, you're familiar with life between life hypnosis or preconception memory or any of these things. Preconception memory is when somebody remembers before they got here to this physical plane, to this human body. And it's amazing information. What's amazing about it, it's very much like the near-death experience, where people are talking about being in this place of light and love, being connected to these angelic beings. And life between life hypnosis is another one. I'm not a die-hard believer saying that hypnosis is real or not real. But what's interesting about these people that are being hypnotized and brought back to prior to their conception, there's a consistent pattern like near-death experience where they are seeing very similar things. And there's a guy named Michael Newton and Linda Backman who were kind of the early adopters of doing this therapy. And what I haven't seen, which was amazing to me, is nobody's taking this life between life hypnosis and comparing it side to side with near-death experience, because they are also experiencing these beings of light and love and connecting with these angelic beings. And I thought, wow, this is really important. Here is something that starts to create this thread that I feel is very important for humanity, because if somebody can go connect with a hypnotherapist and have an experience that's almost as profound as a near-death experience, where they realize that they are beings of light and love, realize that we're all interconnected, then I really believe that we can change this planet in one generation. If enough people can tap in and get this type of understanding, we would recognize our connection. Another area that I thought was very interesting that I came across was induced after-death communication, which Greg, right outside of the bookstore, actually is involved with this, and a guy named Al Bodkin developed, and he was doing, and I'm going to go into it a little bit, but basically, it's another therapy that uses kind of a hypnotic regression. It's not hypnosis, it's a little bit different. It's a rapid eye desensitization system. You guys remember the old movies where they show the guys like stare at the, and so what this induced after-death communication once again gets people into this hyperdimensional, higher dimensional place where they can connect on this plane that we're all connected to. And once again, tying that information in to this whole thread, I feel is very, very important. And I it needs to, I believe it needs to be looked at a lot closer. I think that we need to address these things and say, look, all these things have a similar commonality, and we should all connect them together. So this is just a small chart. This is an older chart. I mean, I put it together in 2002. But this is my model of associated human experience and induced cosmic or spiritual awakening. And I have a whole bunch of different areas here. Now, since then, I mean, this whole frame would be filled up. There's so many other areas that are out there that people connect with. And what I've done is I've kind of created a template of sorts that says, okay, people, euphoric sensations, looking down at body, and then it gets deeper where they connect with light beings, angelic spirits, deceased relatives, all the way down to the center core, which I call infinity, God, the infinite source, which we're all ultimately connected to. And so I feel this stuff's important for people to look at. So one of the other things that I'd like to address here is that there's a lot of important words that have been used for thousands of years. And these words are critical for us to explain these types of phenomena. Heaven, soul, spirit, eternity, God, angel, love. All these things describe something, are words that describe these types of experiences. And if we didn't have these words, there'd be no way to describe these experiences. But there is some dogmatic connection to these words because of religion and different things over the years have kind of utilized these words. So sometimes I'll be talking to people and trying to explain this stuff, and they're like, oh, no, I'm really not into religion, and blah, blah. I'm like, well, no, I'm not into religion, I'm more into spirituality, and I'm trying to define a way to look at this information without it having a dogmatic connection, without it sounding like it's connected to religion, to look at it more as a science, a meta-science. And I think this is where we need to move this information so we can start to analyze it from a critical level to understand that we are connected to this. Because there's a lot of people in this world that religion has pushed them away, or they've never had a mystical experience, even though every day is a mystical experience. Just waking up and being in this physical body is a profound experience, and sometimes we overlook that. So I feel that certain words are very important. And I also feel on the other side that some words are actually very toxic. And these words maybe shouldn't be used in the wrong context. Like even my son growing up, I always told him that I didn't believe in the word HATE, because from my research into all this metaphysics, everything is made of this love energy. It's the underlying force of the universe. So for somebody to believe that HATE is real, I don't think it is. I think it's a false construct. I think it's a word used to manipulate or change or guide a conversation or situation. And I don't agree with that word. And my research has proved otherwise. So there's been a lot of people throughout history that have had NDEs, and it seems as if NDE could be a catalyst, or could have been one of the major catalysts for spiritual change on this planet. I think the first person I heard really point that out was P.M.A. Chapwater, felt that maybe some of these people, these spiritual leaders and prophets in the past had some kind of a near-death experiences, which led them to their ideas. It helped change the world. Even Plato reported incidents. Not that he had one, but he reported incidents that are now called NDE. A lot of different people. Gandhi, Edison talked about how it was very beautiful over there. Nikola Tesla had several bouts of illness as a child, and he is considered one of the biggest geniuses on the planet. Did he tap into this other side? Did he have a near-death experience, or several of them, that allowed him to have a deeper concept of the universe and who we are as people? So I guess the longs are gone, but they described this a little differently than I did. I call it a group near-death and a shared near-death experience. So I'm going to go into some of these a little bit here. So what I see as a group near-death experiences is where multiple people that die and come back together to discuss what had occurred. And there was an incident, I think it was in India, where these three kids were climbing over. They were playing in the field, and lightning storm came, and they said, "Let's get out of here." They all jumped up on the fence at the same time. The fence was hit by lightning. They all had a near-death experience. They all found themselves out of their body, hovering in like this castle-type stone room. And what was interesting is each of them saw a different iconic being, an angel. One was like grandfather dressed in his military fatigue. One saw like an Indian god. I can't remember what the other one saw, but the message was pretty much the same. It's not your time. You're going back. And it's just interesting. And what else was cool was they could all perceive each other's energy field, and they all knew that they were getting a similar message, but they knew that the message was different for each one of them, meaning that they were seeing it from a different person, a different iconic figure. So I would call that a group near-death experience. A shared near-death experience is where somebody is passing and the hospice worker or family member actually experienced that with them. There's reports of hospice workers moving down that tunnel, being part of that experience, going towards that light. And so I would consider that a shared near-death experience. Another thing in near-death, which I think is very, very powerful, very significant, is a spontaneous healing that occurs during near-death experience. And a lot of you are probably familiar with Anita and Evan's near-death experience. Benedict is a little less known, but they left their body. In Anita Majori's case, she's died of cancer. Cancer has taken her whole body over, and she basically gets outside of her body and recognizes that her thought patterns are not in sync with her body, and she's had a lot of fears and a lot of other stuff that just wasn't resonating with her being alive. And once she could see this from a higher dimensional perspective, a higher place, she recognized that I gotta change these ideas. I gotta change the way I think, because this isn't good. This isn't healthy. Goes back into her body, goes into spontaneous remission, and completely heals. So, Evan Alexander was the same thing. He had like a 5 or 10% chance of living. And he got outside and saw things, and so did Thomas Nolan Benedict. He saw life. He felt that we as humans were a virus on the planet, had a very negative attitude towards humanity and people, leaves his body, gets outside his body, and says, whoa, we are beautiful souls, existing on a beautiful planet, in a beautiful universe. And once he changed that belief system, he came back into his body and lived for a long time after that. And his story is an amazing story. I've got a short synopsis. He actually was going down the tunnel of light with a being of light, an angel or a being of light. And he said, whoa, hold up, whoa, what's going on here? I want to know where I'm going. I want to know what's happening here. And this being of light's like, whoa, what's up? What do you want to see? He said, well, I'd like to see the universe. And it's like an exit stage left, and just this angel of light took him through the universe, and he went through these big ebbs and flows of energy, and talks about these rivers of energy and how we're connected in this flow. And it's just very, very interesting. And he came back into his body. And according to him, he died in like a hospice situation in his home, so it's hard to quantify but according to Benedict, he was dead for a long period of time, over half an hour, according to him. Hard to quantify because he wasn't in a hospital, but still, his story is amazing. So, as I was digging through all these different books and came across Dr. Kenneth Ring's book, and Dr. Kenneth Ring wrote a book called Mindsight. And some of you might have heard this. Somebody else, one of the other lectures, talked about how near-death experience in the blind. And, you know, if anybody needs to prove that near-death experience is real to themselves, I mean, I know you guys are not that proud. It just sure seems to me that blind near-death experience basically, you know, I mean, it's an amazing phenomenon where people that were blind, in some cases from birth, will die in a clinical hospital setting, flatline, and will see for the first time, and see clearer than they've ever seen before. And there was even a case where somebody, this happened to somebody, and when they revived this person, they were, oh, it's unbelievable, I can see everything, I can see the medical instruments, and I could see that the anesthesiologist had mixed match thoughts. And they're all, what? And the anesthesiologist pulled his pants up and sure enough. So there's a lot of great information out there that needs to be looked at and addressed in more of a scientific kind of a platform, you know, and take it to something to make it really, I don't know. That's why I wrote the Soul Code. So that was my underlying premise. So I'm going to go into other connections to our soul and things that research that I've come across. Elizabeth and Neil Carmen wrote a book called The Cosmic Cradle. I've read a few books by now. And what they found is they were researching this preconception memory. And in this preconception memory, what they found is there's a kind of a cosmic contract that's made between, I mean, all of us in this room made it with the people, our parents, that brought us here. And so there's an agreement between parents and this soul before they're ever born. And so it's an interesting information that they've brought forward. And it's like at a subconscious level, this agreement. And there's an Aborigine tribe that actually that knows about this kind of thing, and they look at it as kind of a ritual. One of the things I found in this research is that it seems as if right before we come into these physical bodies, and we're jumping off the diving board in life, is that we say, and it seems to come up over and over again, that I want to remember this place of light and love that I come from. And this is all within us. They want to remember, and this is the most important thing. I want to remember this. But as they're jumping into life, they say, oh, no, even more importantly, I want to remember to spread this light and love while I'm here. And that seems to be a thought that, from my research, has come to all 8 billion of us on this planet, but for some reason, we kind of forgot. There's a lot of information, too, on preconception communication, kind of along the same lines as the Carmens, and these two ladies have written books on it. And it seems as if, from their conclusion, human beings are sold before conception, and there was that communication that I just talked about, and there are agreements made, and sometimes these messages come through dreams and other anomalous things. I've heard cases where they see a sphere of light, and then they have a baby that night, and these messages seem to go. The mothers get these messages a lot more commonly than the fathers. But it was just interesting to come across their material after I'd read Neil and Elizabeth Carmen's books, and how similar this information is. And there's another case where more information needs to be taken and looked at next to one another. And it ties into this, to all these other transformative spiritual kind of occurrences that happen to people. I'm going to go into what I mentioned a little bit earlier, is that this life between life is a clinical therapy. It's not some voodoo, eat this drug, let's go sit out in the forest kind of thing. This is an actual therapy. And what's amazing is once people get a glimpse of this in-between, of this prior to conception energy field where we exist before we came here, is that people heal. If they have kind of emotional trauma or any kind of issues at a mental or psychological level, once they get a peek onto this, into this dimension that we're a part of, it's kind of away from the physical body, it's amazing. They heal. And there's cases where people actually not only mentally heal, but physically heal. Because remember, we were talking about how Anita Major and these other people, once they get in that hyperdimensional or higher dimensional state, they see themselves at a different perspective. And all of a sudden it's like, wow, these physical things heal. It's just amazing. So I think there's a lot here that needs to really be looked at. And you know, Michael Newton says that he kind of was the first guy, but there was another guy named Dr. Joel Linton, working with a guy named Joe Fisher that actually wrote the first book about this. What I recoined trans-dimensional therapy. That's my little. Hope you guys like it. I made that one up. Alan Bodkin, who was using rapid eye desensitization, accidentally changed his protocols and created induced after-death communication, which I mentioned a little bit as well. And this induced after-death communication, I would also put it under the trans-dimensional therapy heading. And it's just amazing. So I'm going to go into a quick story here about, because I'm always trying to quantify this information. I'm kind of an evidence-based person. I like science, and I always want things to make sense to me. I mean, not that all things need to make sense, but I like things to have a quantifiable, be kind of quantifiable. So there was a case where this woman, her and her best friend were having a party, and she had asked, she had kind of asked her best friend's brother to come to the party, and he had to drive a long distance. Well, on the way to the party, he was in a car wreck and he died. And she felt terrible about it. And if I was going to embellish her story, she might have flirted with her a little bit. Come on, let me get lucky. That's my embellishment of the story. But he comes and he dies in the car. So she felt bad about it. And then she, read an article about this Dr. Alan Bodkin, who was having great success having people connect with deceased loved ones and relatives. Well, and he was having great success with a lot of post-traumatic stress and a lot of things, and that's how we started in Chicago at the Veterans Hospital doing that for post-traumatic stress. But she says, I read this article, I'm gonna go check it. I don't believe this stuff. And I think even when she got to his office, she said, this guy doesn't look like a shrink or a psychologist. He looks like a kid's baseball coach or something. She was like, I'm not taking it seriously. She goes into the session, and not only did he appear and tell her, and this is what usually happens in these cases, they say, I'm in a better place, everything is all right, don't feel bad, everything, I'm in a loving place, and just very reassuring stuff. But she said something strange was going on. She could see this dog jumping around. And she tells Bodkin, because she's in this state, she's like, there's a dog, I see a dog jumping around here. Huh? And she got in Bodkin's like, what? I've never heard of anything like this. So later her friend calls her up, or she calls her friend, and she said, hey, did you do that thing? Oh yeah, I went, no, it seemed like might have been your brother, I don't know, might have been my own subconscious, and it was really interesting. And she said, but the strangest thing was that there was this dog jumping around, and it was like, and even the doctor thought it was strange. Well, come to find out that was a dog that had been in the family, or her friend's sister had a dog, and the dog had died. But she described the dog perfectly, and it was their dog. It was a dog that her friend sister. So it was just for me little bits and pieces of quantifiable information I like to come across. That's always very interesting. And here it is right here. I don't know if anybody's read this here. It says that the IADC should become a common tool for psychologists, repertoire patients, and that's a quote by Bodkin. I pulled that. So I've got another speculative model here. Now this is pretty wild stuff here. This is basically what I call a speculative model of data reported by people claiming to have cosmic or spiritual awakening. It's a cross between what people in this LBL, life between life, and what preconception memory people talk about. And what I've done is I've put together a model of heaven, basically, of what is reported by people that have been on the other side. And it's just speculative. I mean, I'm hoping that someday people take this and rearrange it and change it and make it into something more more tangible or more realistic. But what's interesting, it seems as if we go through this point here, and people can get stuck here. And the reason, and this is just from my research, I don't know if it's right, but it seems as if the reason people don't necessarily get home, which 99.9% I believe do, and obviously everybody in this room did because we're all back here, they get stuck. And because they don't want to look at themselves. They can't forgive themselves. There was a lady, is Clem in here? Clem's wife, Diana, comes, Clem, I'm lecturing, you're sleeping. Is it that exciting? So Clem's ex-wife had a near-death experience. And in her experience, she had a stroke, and she said she was back up against a wall. And in this experience, it was like her life was trying to flash before her. And she refused. She was like, no, I don't want to. And finally, when she got there and said, I forgive myself. I was not a perfect person. And when she thought that thought, she was immersed in light. Light completely, and then so I believe, and sometimes certain types of condition, people think, oh, I was a sinner, or I did this bad, or I did that bad. They refuse to look at themselves and forgive themselves. And by doing that, they're stopping themselves, and they end up becoming a ghost and hovering around. But I believe that they eventually that everybody gets home, gets back. I call home heaven. They eventually get home, and just sometimes they waste time because they're concerned about their own stuff. And I think that is where sometimes these souls will cluster and end up being, what biblically is called hell or whatever, just souls that haven't made it home. They're a little confused, and sometimes they get bored and they become ghosts or whatever. But yet, what this other evidence, so that's getting stuck. But then we get through, and it seems as if we're encountered with these elders, these much bigger beings of light, these beings of light that are, a lot of times people see them as an iconic religious figure or whatever, because when we come back into our body from the near death, we're trying to uncompress all this information. But from the LBM, the life between life, they're not looked at as iconic figures. They're not looked at as religious figures. They're seen as beings of love and light. But what's interesting, it seems as if we end up in this place where we resonate and we end up with other beings like us, that there's a place out there on this other side where the souls are vibrating in a similar frequency or wavelength to us. And those are our friends for potentially tens of thousands of years. And even Daniel Brinkley, in his near-death experience, he talks about how he's whizzing through and he's going to some place, he's not sure where, but he's going through all these different levels and vibratory energies. And I think he was going to his soul group. And so the term soulmate comes from the idea that you get lucky enough in a single lifetime to meet somebody that's in this soul group, but yet it's not common. From the research seems to point to not very common. But what's really interesting is when we come back into life, we go into this wheel of karma, and actually there's situations where we're looking at all these different situations where we could be born into. And these situations have to do with what our karmic lessons are. And it sure seems to me, from my research, I could be wrong, is that what we do in a given lifetime or lifetimes prior to coming back gives us better options to where we want to reincarnate into. And that is an interesting kind of premise. Depending on how we are and how we treat other people is what our growth cycle is going to be in our next life. But it even gets to a point where Elizabeth and Neil Carmen have a story about, I can't remember his name, but their book Cosmic Cradle has a lot of stories like this, where this guy has a memory of being with a being of light, and the being of light shows him a situation. There's a couple in a bedroom, and it says, you can be born into this family. This is a very wealthy family. You're going to have a really good life. It's going to be really easy. And the being of light shows him another couple in the bedroom and says, you can be born into this family. This is a middle class family. You're not going to get all that stuff, but you're going to learn more as a spiritual being. You're going to have a little more knocks in life. You'll have more growth periods. You'll learn more in this family. And then the being of light shows him a third family that's in the front seat of a car, and there's a baby asleep in the back seat, and basically says, you can be born in this family, and in this family, you are going to have a much harder life. Things are not going to be easy, but you're going to learn the most spiritually in this situation. And he says, that's the one, that's the one. So he remembers this his whole life. So as a kid, he tries to tell his mom, hey, Mom, I have this memory. Oh, and he has an older sister, too. That was the baby in the backseat. So everything kind of made sense. And his mom said, no, go play with your friends. It's just totally ignored it. So he felt pretty uncomfortable bringing it up. So then, years later, I think he's moved out of the house, and his parents are there, and he comes back to visit. He says, look, I've had this memory my whole life. I need to know if it's a dream or if it's real. So he tells the whole story, and his mom looks over at his dad and with an angry tone and says, I cannot believe you told him. So, I mean, it basically proved that it was a real story, that it really did happen, and everything he perceived was real. And so it's interesting. So this is this wheel of life that we come into and that we pick. So if people say that, think that their circumstances and where they were born and all that stuff, no, they chose it for a growth pattern. And I think that all 8 billion of us chose this planet at this time for a reason. And this kind of information needs to be looked at and addressed, because I really believe it can help us take a major step in our spiritual evolution to create a better planet. Thank you.